In 1922, Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck with hopes of making a living. She was supposed to be the household maid for the Gruber family, but she had no idea about the dark places her fate would take her. Welcome to Fridays with Tony, where we explore mysteries that are unusual, unsettling, and often unsolved. I'm Tony, and every other Friday we have thrilling tales to delve into with you. Like and subscribe, and click the bell icon to be notified when a new story is posted. This is the story of an isolated farmstead in the Bavarian countryside, nestled behind a tiny hamlet called Kaifeck. Hinterkaifeck, as it was known, sat alone, bordered by dense woods, quiet except for the sounds of the farm animals and the daily routines of the people who lived there. It was home to Andreas Gruber, his wife, Keddie, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's two children, 7-year-old Keddie Jr. and 2-year-old Joseph. But there was another member within the household, a maid named Maria Baumgartner, who arrived on March 31st, 1922. To the outside world, the Grubers were an unremarkable family, self-sufficient and isolated. But in the small village, their name carried whispers. People talked about the grim rumors that had shadowed them for years, rumors of an incestuous relationship between Andreas and Victoria. And this wasn't just idle gossip. They had been convicted of it in court. Their reputation set them apart, making them a family that others kept at arm's length. And yet, there were signs. Strange, unexplained signs that something was closing in on them. In the weeks before March 31st, 1922, Hinterkaifeck became a place of eerie disturbances. The old maid had quit 6 months earlier, refusing to stay another night in the house because she believed it was haunted. She had heard footsteps in the attic, late at night, when no one should have been up there. Andreas dismissed her claims. He was not a man to give in to fear. But then, things began happening that even he couldn't ignore. One winter morning, he stepped outside and found footprints in the snow, leading from the dark woods toward the farm. He followed them with his eyes, tracking their path straight to the house. But there were no returning footprints. Whoever had walked to Hinterkaifeck had never left. A few days later, an unfamiliar newspaper appeared on their property. No one in the household had bought it, and no neighbors subscribed to that edition. It was as if someone had left it there deliberately, a sign that a stranger had been near, or worse, had already been inside. Then, the keys went missing. A small detail, easy to overlook, until they realized it meant someone had access to the house, and the noises continued. Every so often they would hear movement above them, the sound of footsteps pacing across the attic floor. Andreas would search the house, lantern in hand, determined to find the intruder. But every time, he came up empty. The family was uneasy. They knew something was wrong, but Andreas refused to go to the police. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness, or maybe deep down he didn't want to know the truth. Whatever the reason, he dismissed the idea of danger. He told the neighbors it was probably just pranksters. But then little Keddie, his niece, saw something that terrified her. The night before March 31st, 1922, she told a friend that her mother had run away from the house after a fight, disappearing into the woods. Something had driven Victoria to flee into the darkness. Something, or someone, had filled the home with unbearable tension. And then, the night of March 31st arrived. It was a night that should have been ordinary. The new maid Maria had just arrived. The animals were in their stalls. The lamps were being extinguished, and the family was settling in for the evening. No one outside the farm would have suspected that within hours, Hinterkaifeck would fall into a chilling silence. It started with the barn. One by one, 4 members of the family were lured inside. Perhaps they heard something, an animal, disturbed, a noise that didn't belong. Maybe they were called out, tricked into thinking someone needed help. Whatever drew them out there, it made sure they never got out of there alive. Andreas was the first to die in that barn. His wife followed, then Victoria, and then little Keddie. With the 4 bodies hidden under a pile of hay, the killer wasn't finished. They entered the house where Maria and little Joseph remained. The maid was likely asleep when the murderer found her. Then came Joseph, the 2-year-old boy, sleeping in his crib. He was the last to die. For 4 days, Hinterkaifeck sat in eerie silence. No one from the Gruber household had been seen or heard from, but in a town as small and insular as this, the family's absence didn't go unnoticed. The first warning signs came on April 1st, when little Keddie failed to show up at school. Victoria, a devoted choir singer, missed church that Sunday, raising further concern. Then, the mail began to pile up at the post office, an unusual sight for a family that should have been tending to daily farm duties. Still, no one acted right away. On April 1st, 2 traveling coffee salesmen, the Sharovsky brothers, stopped by Hinterkaifeck to take an order. They knocked, but there was no answer. Walking around the yard, they noticed something odd. The gate to the machine shed was open, but the farm itself seemed lifeless. Unsettled, they left, unaware they had just stood at the doorstep of a crime scene. Then came Albert Hoffner, a mechanic who arrived on April 4th to repair the farm's diesel engine. As he approached, he expected to be greeted by the Gruber family, but instead, he found only silence. The animals were restless, lowing in their stalls, and the farm dog barked from inside the barn, yet not a single person emerged from the house. Hoffner waited an hour, then, seeing no one, decided to fix the engine himself. He worked for several hours, all the while hearing nothing but the sounds of the livestock. Someone had been feeding the animals recently, meaning that whoever had last tended to them was still on the farm, or had been very recently. By the evening of April 4th, the tension in the village had grown. This wasn't normal. Neighbors decided they could wait no longer. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a local farmer, gathered 2 men, Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel, and set off for Hinterkaifeck. He first sent his 16-year-old son and stepson to knock on the door, but they returned with the same report: silence. Determined to get inside, the men forced open the barn door. The sight that awaited them would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There, buried under a heap of hay, were 4 bodies: Andreas, Keddie Sr., Victoria, and little Keddie. Blood had soaked into the straw beneath them. Their heads were brutally crushed, their skulls shattered. The men recoiled in horror, but their search wasn't over. Moving into the farmhouse, they found Maria the maid slain in her bed, and in Victoria's room, little Joseph lay lifeless in his crib, partially covered by one of his mother's dresses. Someone had tried to drape bedding over Maria as well, as if in a twisted attempt to conceal the horror. By April 5th, police from Munich and the nearby town of Schrobenhausen arrived at the farm, only to find a crime scene already ruined. In the hours following the discovery, word had spread, and neighbors had flooded the farm, moving bodies, shifting items, even cooking a meal in the Gruber's kitchen, as if the horror in the barn had no weight. Any hope of preserving critical evidence was lost. Despite this, investigators pieced together crucial details. The court physician, Dr. Johann Baptist Müller, performed autopsies on the barn floor. His findings were as gruesome as the crime itself. Each victim had been attacked with a sharp-edged farm tool, likely a mattock. The injuries were severe. Andreas's cheekbones were pushed outward from the force of the blows. Victoria's skull was completely smashed, and little Keddie Jr. had suffered such a devastating head wound that her lower jaw was shattered. The most harrowing discovery was that Keddie had not died immediately. Clumps of her hair were found in her hands, torn out in agony as she clung to life for hours after the attack. The maid and baby Joseph suffered the same brutal fate. Maria's skull was crushed as she lay in bed. Joseph, too young to understand the horror, had been attacked as he slept. Now here's the strangest detail. For at least 3 days after the killings, someone had been living at Hinterkaifeck. The cows were milked, the pigs and chickens were fed, and food had been eaten in the kitchen. A supply of bread had been consumed, meat had been cut from the pantry, and the fireplace had been used each day. A passing villager even saw smoke rising from the chimney. But when he approached, a figure inside shone a lantern in his direction, scaring him off. Whoever committed the crime had stayed in the house, carrying on as if nothing had happened. Investigators found no signs of forced entry, which meant the killer had either been let in or was already inside when the attack began. The murder weapon, a mattock, was missing. It wasn't until a year later, during the farm's demolition, that the blood-caked tool was found hidden in the attic. The weapon had been handmade, its handle carved by a former farmhand who later admitted to crafting one for the Grubers. This meant the killer either took it from the property or had access to it beforehand. The fact that it was returned and concealed in the attic hinted at an intimate knowledge of the farm. Money and valuables were left untouched, ruling out a robbery as a motive. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was targeted. Someone had harbored deep rage against the Grubers. One of the more chilling clues emerged during the demolition, a pocket knife that no one in the family had owned. The former maid, Crescence Reiger, said she had seen it before but didn't know to whom it belonged. Could it have been dropped by the killer? A small slip in an otherwise methodically executed crime, or had it belonged to someone else who had visited the farm before? But there were many more problems. The few crime scene photographs that exist were taken too late to capture everything accurately. Fingerprinting, although available in 1922, was never conducted. And then there was the most bizarre turn of all. The victims' heads were removed and sent to Munich for examination by psychics. Authorities, desperate for a breakthrough, hoped clairvoyance could extract some supernatural clue, but they didn't. To make things worse, the skulls were lost in the chaos of World War II, leaving behind only rumors and missed opportunities for modern forensic analysis. Despite all this, there were real suspects. The first suspect was the man who led the search for the bodies, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. At first glance, Lorenz was just a concerned neighbor, but his connection to the Gruber family ran deep. He had been romantically involved with Victoria, and for a time, he believed himself to be the father of little Joseph. He had even planned to marry Victoria, but Andreas Gruber, her father and rumored lover, stood in the way. The relationship collapsed, and Lorenz moved on, marrying another woman. But tragedy struck. The child he had with his new wife died shortly after birth. Meanwhile, rumors swirled that Joseph, the boy he had once claimed as his own, might actually have been Andreas's child. Was that the breaking point? Did Lorenz, driven by grief, shame, or sheer fury, decide to erase the entire family? Suspicion deepened when people observed his strange behavior at the crime scene. While others recoiled in horror, he was calm. He walked through the house with familiarity. And most unsettling of all, he unlocked the door with a key, despite the fact that the Gruber family's house key had gone missing before the murders. When confronted, he brushed it off, claiming he was simply looking for his son Joseph. But was that a slip of the tongue? A confession hidden in plain sight? The police questioned him extensively, but despite all the circumstantial evidence, they couldn't pin anything on him. He had alibis. He fought legal battles against those who accused him. Eventually, he died in 1941, still insisting he had nothing to do with the crime. Yet to this day, many still believe Lorenz Schlittenbauer got away with murder, but others sided with a completely different story. Some villagers believed that Victoria's dead husband, Carl Gabriel, had somehow survived the war and returned only to find his wife entangled in something monstrous. The idea had all the makings of a tragic legend: an undead husband, a family secret too shameful to bear, and a massacre carried out in the name of vengeance. Investigators took the theory seriously enough to look into it, but every record pointed to the same conclusion. Carl Gabriel had died in 1914 on a battlefield far from Hinterkaifeck. His fellow soldiers confirmed it. His name was on casualty lists. If Carl had returned, he had done so as a man without a face, without a name, without a trace. So if it wasn't Lorenz, and if Carl Gabriel was truly dead, then who was it? Over the years, other names surfaced. a former farmhand who had once stolen from the Grubers and spoke bitterly about them, a pair of brothers known for lurking around the property, even vagrants and criminals passing through. Each theory carried a hint of possibility, but nothing ever stuck. Decades later, in 1951, a dying woman made a shocking claim. She said her brothers had once confessed to the murders. One of them had supposedly regretted losing a pocket knife at the scene. Investigators looked into it, but after nearly 30 years, any evidence that could have connected them to the crime was long gone. And then, in 1971, another letter arrived. A woman wrote to the police claiming that when she was a child, her mother had hosted the mother of two men who later confessed to killing the Grubers. One of them had mentioned that they left behind a knife, a detail that matched the one found at the farm years earlier. But, like every other lead, it slipped through the cracks of history, unprovable and incomplete. By 1986, more than 60 years after the murders, an aging detective tried one last time to find answers. He re-interviewed elderly witnesses, revisited old evidence, and combed through every surviving document. But there was nothing left to find. The case was officially closed in 1955, yet it never truly faded. The farm itself was demolished, but the story of Hinterkaifeck remained, haunting Germany's crime history like an unfinished nightmare. Now, if you're baffled by this case, the next one is equally as haunting. At Cabin 28, the lifeless bodies of 3 people were discovered, their lives brutally ended by an unknown perpetrator. But that wasn't all. A little girl was missing from the crime scene, and it was only years later that the investigators finally unraveled this terrifying mystery. The Sharp family had come to Keddie looking for a new beginning. In July of 1979, Glenna Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old mother of 5, packed up her life in Connecticut and moved across the country to Northern California. She had left behind an abusive marriage, determined to carve out a better future for her children. Keddie, a small wooded community in the Sierra Nevada mountains, seemed like a place where they could finally settle. It wasn't a thriving town anymore. The once popular mountain resort had fallen on hard times, but for Sue, it was a refuge. She rented Cabin 28, a modest 2-bedroom wooden home at the Keddie Resort. The cabin had once been occupied by the county sheriff, an eerie detail that would later make this story much more unsettling. Life there wasn't easy with 5 kids in a cramped space and money stretched thin, but Sue was determined to provide a stable home. She was known as a kind, attentive mother doing the best she could on her own. Her children, 15-year-old John, 14-year-old Sheila, 12-year-old Tina, 10-year-old Rick, sometimes listed as 9 in early reports, and 5-year-old Greg, adjusted quickly. They made friends in nearby Quincy, where they attended school. Despite their struggles, the Sharps had settled into a rhythm. Keddie, surrounded by towering pines and quiet roads, felt safe. But Cabin 28 was about to become infamous, a sight that would haunt the town for decades. The morning of April 11th, 1981 started like any other Saturday. The Sharp family went about their usual routine, unaware of the darkness creeping toward them. Around midday, Sue and Sheila drove from Keddie to the nearby town of Quincy. They were there to pick up 15-year-old John and his 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate. The 2 boys had been in town socializing. Some reports suggest they were at a gathering or even a baseball tryout. Either way, they were hitchhiking home when Sue happened to spot them and offered them a ride back to Keddie. By 3:30 p.m., John and Dana headed back out, again hitchhiking to Quincy, where they spent the afternoon. Witnesses later placed them in the town's downtown area, though their exact activities remain unclear. There were rumors of a party that night, possibly involving underage drinking or drugs, which might explain why some potential witnesses hesitated to come forward later. Meanwhile, back at Cabin 28, Sue and her younger children were settling in for the night. Rick and Greg, her 2 youngest sons, had invited their 12-year-old friend Justin Smart over for a sleepover. Justin was the son of the Sharps' neighbors, Marilyn and Martin, who lived just a few cabins away in cabin 26. The kids played, unaware that these seemingly harmless connections would later take a sinister turn. 14-year-old Sheila had her own plans for the night. She was staying over at the Seabolt's cabin, number 27, right next door. Tina, the 12-year-old, initially joined her there to watch television but left around 9:30 p.m. She had asked the Seabolts for the time before heading back home, as if she knew she was expected to be in bed soon. Sheila, by a stroke of fate, remained at the Seabolts overnight. As you're about to see, this decision ended up saving her life. The quiet of Keddie was broken only by the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But sometime after 10 p.m., John and Dana were expected back from Quincy. Sue had told them not to hitchhike, but they had planned to anyway. Somewhere in that window of time, between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m., they got a ride back to the cabin. A dark green van was reportedly seen parked outside cabin 28 around 9 p.m., an unusual sight in the small community. It was an observation that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later add to the web of unanswered questions. By all accounts, it was a quiet night. The Seabolt family heard nothing unusual, but in cabin 16, not far from the Sharps, a couple was startled awake around 1:15 a.m. by the sound of muffled screams. They couldn't tell where the noise was coming from. After a few moments, the house fell silent again. Convinced it was nothing more than a passing disturbance, they went back to sleep, never realizing they might have been listening to the final moments of the people next door. In the early hours of Sunday, April 12, 1981, after spending the night next door at the Seabolt family's cabin, Sheila returned home around 8 a.m., expecting an ordinary morning. What she found instead shattered any sense of normalcy forever. As she stepped inside, the scene before her was so shocking that her mind barely processed it. There, on the living room floor, were the bloodied, lifeless bodies of her mother, Sue Sharp, her older brother, John, and his friend, Dana Wingate. Sheila's instincts took over. She turned and ran, screaming back to the Seabolts' cabin, unable to comprehend what she had just seen. The Seabolts, realizing something terrible had happened, sprang into action, but there was no phone in their cabin. At 8:05 a.m., a call was placed to the Plumas County Sheriff's Department from the Keddie Lodge, reporting a possible homicide at cabin 28. Meanwhile, Sheila, despite the overwhelming terror, had one desperate question. What about her younger siblings? Neighbor Jamie Seabolt took it upon himself to check. Entering the cabin through the back door, he made a chilling discovery. In a bedroom off the living room, Sheila's two little brothers, Rick and Greg, along with their friend, 12-year-old Justin Smart, were still asleep. Miraculously, they were unharmed. But the crime scene was too gruesome to risk contaminating it further. Instead of walking them through the cabin, Jamie and Sheila carefully lifted the boys out through a bedroom window to safety. As officers from the Plumas County Sheriff's Department arrived, the weight of what had happened inside cabin 28 became clearer. Deputy Hank Clement was the first to step through the front door. What he saw inside would haunt him forever. A blanket had been draped over Sue Sharp's body, almost as if someone had tried to soften the horror of the scene, but there was no way to obscure what had taken place in that cabin. Blood covered the walls, the ceiling, the furniture. The violence had been frenzied and unrelenting. The telephone was off the hook, the lights were turned off, and the curtains had been drawn shut, as if someone had deliberately controlled the environment, possibly to prevent anyone from hearing or seeing what had unfolded. The sheer level of violence suggested multiple attackers. All three victims, Sue, John, and Dana, had been bound, stabbed, and beaten with overwhelming force. The evidence painted a grim picture of what had taken place in the final moments of their lives. 15-year-old John Sharp lay closest to the front door, his body positioned face up. His wrists and ankles had been tightly bound with medical tape and electrical cord. The same cord stretched from his ankles to those of Dana Wingate, binding them together. Dana, 17, was found face down, his battered head resting partially on a pillow. His feet were secured with the same cord that tied him to John. Sue Sharp, 36, lay near the sofa, her body partially covered by a blanket. She had been gagged, her own underwear and a blue bandana stuffed into her mouth, secured with medical tape. It appeared that she had been moved and arranged after death, possibly by the killer, in a twisted act of mock decency. Each of the victims had suffered multiple stab wounds and severe blunt force trauma. Blood had pooled beneath their bodies, splattered across the room, even soaking into the soles of Sue's bare feet and one of the boys' shoes, suggesting they may have still been moving during the attack. Sue and John both had their throats slashed. Sue's wound was so deep that it severed her larynx and even nicked her spine. John's throat had been cut open in a similarly brutal manner. Dana had been beaten beyond recognition, suffering multiple head injuries, but unlike the others, he had not been killed by a knife or a blunt object. He had been manually strangled. There were also signs that Sue had fought back with everything she had. Defensive wounds on her arms revealed a desperate struggle, one that tragically she could not win. Scattered around the room were several weapons, each one contributing to the horror. On the floor lay a bloody steak knife, its blade bent, evidence of the extreme force used in the attack. On a small wooden table near the kitchen, a butcher knife and a claw hammer sat side by side, both covered in blood. These weapons had likely been taken from Sue's own kitchen. But then came an unsettling discovery. One of the victims had an imprint on their head, a distinct mark that matched the butt of a Daisy 880 BB pellet rifle. The weapon itself was nowhere to be found. This meant the killers had brought it with them and later took it away. A later review would determine that at least one other hammer had also been used in the attack, but it too was missing. While some of the weapons were left behind, the fact that others were taken suggested something chilling. The killers had come prepared. As investigators worked through the crime scene, they were faced with another horrifying realization. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing. In the chaos of discovering the bodies, it took hours before anyone noticed that one of the Sharp children was unaccounted for. A bloody handprint on the exterior railing of the back stairs and some bloodstains on the back steps pointed to something deeply disturbing. Tina had been taken, but by whom? And was she still alive? The evidence suggested a degree of planning. There were no usable fingerprints at the crime scene, indicating the perpetrators had likely worn gloves. There were also no blood trails leading away from the cabin, meaning none of the killers had sustained any serious injuries during the attack. Then there was the fact that there was no sign of forced entry. Did the killers know the Sharps? Had they been let in, or was the door simply left unlocked, making it easy for them to slip inside? Plumas County Sheriff Doug Thomas was certain of one thing from the start. Whoever carried out the Keddie murders didn't act alone. Given the level of force used, the number of victims, and the sheer brutality of the crime, the evidence pointed to multiple perpetrators. But beyond that, nothing about the case made sense. The murders were savage, but they didn't seem to have a clear motive. No large sums of money were missing. There was no sign that the victims had been involved in drug activity or anything criminal. Rumors swirled about potential connections to trafficking or cult activity, but Sheriff Thomas quickly dismissed them as baseless. With nothing obvious linking the victims to this kind of targeted violence, investigators were left grasping at leads. The small town of Keddie, with its quiet roads and isolated cabins, wasn't exactly filled with criminal suspects, but two names kept surfacing: Marty Smart, and John Bo Boobity. Marty Smart was the stepfather of 12-year-old Justin Smart, one of the boys who had been asleep in the cabin that night. Marty and his wife Marilyn had socialized with Sue Sharp, but their marriage was rocky. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Sue had reportedly become a confidant to Marilyn, encouraging her to leave Marty if he was abusive. Marty, by all accounts, despised Sue for this. Witnesses later recalled hearing him rant about her, blaming her for interfering in his marriage. Then came another troubling detail. Marty told investigators that a claw hammer of his had recently gone missing from his home. Given that a hammer had been used in the murders and that one hammer was suspiciously absent from the crime scene, this wasn't something investigators could ignore. But Marty wasn't the only one under scrutiny. John Bo Boobity, often called Bo, was a man with a history, an ex-con from Chicago with suspected ties to organized crime. He had arrived in Keddie just 10 days before the murders and was staying at the Smarts' cabin. What exactly brought him there wasn't clear, but his presence only added to the growing unease around Marty. On the night of April 11th, the two men were seen drinking at the backdoor bar. They left shortly before closing time, around 2 a.m., and returned to the Smart cabin, just a short walk from the Sharps. Marty later told investigators that after leaving the bar, he and Bo had returned briefly with Marilyn for a final drink before heading home. He claimed that he took some medication and went to bed. But Marilyn's version of events didn't perfectly match Marty's. Over time, she grew increasingly suspicious of both him and Bo. And then just days after the murders, both men abruptly left Keddie. Bo returning to Chicago and Marty relocating to Klamath, California, before eventually leaving the state altogether. When investigators questioned Marty and Bo, both denied any involvement. Sheriff Thomas later insisted that the men had alibis and had passed polygraph tests. But in the years that followed, doubts surfaced about how those polygraphs had been conducted, particularly because Marty was friendly with Sheriff Thomas. The idea that the investigation might have been compromised was one that many people, including later investigators, couldn't ignore. With no physical evidence, including fingerprints or blood, tying Marty or Bo directly to the murders, the case stalled. Sheriff Thomas stood by his belief that they were innocent, but many disagreed. And they weren't just basing their suspicions on Marty's history or Bo's criminal ties. At first, it seemed like the three young boys who survived the night, Rick, Greg, and Justin Smart, had slept through the entire ordeal. But as time passed, Justin's statements began to change. In later interviews, including one conducted under hypnosis, Justin claimed he had seen something, or maybe he had dreamt it. Either way, what he described was chilling. He spoke of two men in the cabin that night. One had short hair and glasses. The other had long hair, a mustache, and also wore glasses. One of them had a hammer. In Justin's account, John and Dana arrived in the middle of the attack, and a violent struggle broke out. Then came the most disturbing detail. Justin said he saw Tina being taken out the back door by one of the men. At the time, this statement seemed almost impossible to verify, but years later, they started to make sense. To follow up on Justin's claims, law enforcement had composite sketches drawn based on his descriptions. But in yet another odd decision, the Plumas County Sheriff's Department didn't use a trained forensic artist. Instead, they had a local civilian with no professional experience create the sketches. The resulting images, a pair of men wearing sunglasses, one with a mustache, were released to the public. But without any clear suspects to match them to, the sketches didn't lead to an arrest. Looking back, they bore a resemblance to Bo and possibly Marty, but at the time, nothing was conclusive. Outside of Marty and Bo, investigators struggled to develop other strong suspects. The victims' own family members were quickly ruled out. Sheila had been next door when the murders happened, and Sue's ex-husband was on the East Coast at the time, with a solid alibi. There were whispers in town that John and Dana might have gotten mixed up with the wrong people. Dana in particular had a reputation for getting into trouble. Some suggested that the murders might have been the result of a drug deal gone wrong, but when police searched the cabin, they found nothing to suggest drug activity. Then there was the idea that Sue herself had been the target. Some speculated that her advice to Marilyn had enraged Marty to the point that he sought revenge. Others wondered if Bo's criminal connections played a role. After all, for some reason, the California Department of Justice had sent organized crime agents to assist in the investigation instead of homicide detectives. Despite these various angles, none were aggressively pursued at the time. By the end of May 1981, with Tina still missing and no arrests, the case was slipping further out of reach. Sheriff Doug Thomas left the department just 3 months after the murders, taking a job with the very same DOJ that had been involved in the case. Meanwhile, his deputy, Lieutenant Don Stoy, kept working leads, but the momentum had faded. The biggest problem investigators faced was the complete lack of an obvious motive. For the surviving Sharp children, this was a devastating realization. They were sent to live with an aunt out of state, but eventually they were separated and placed into foster care. Decades after the murders, the Keddie case was revived by a man who refused to let it be forgotten. In 2010, Greg Hagwood became the sheriff of Plumas County. But for him, this was personal. Back in 1981, he had known the Sharp children. Johnny and Dana had been his classmates. His own mother had been Tina's teacher. And even all these years later, the crime still haunted him. By 2013, he had made it his mission to re-examine everything. He brought in Mike Gamberg, a former deputy who had also known the victims and had even coached Johnny and Dana in martial arts. Gamberg had been with the sheriff's office at the time of the original murders, but due to department politics, he had been kept away from the case. Now, for the first time, he had free rein to investigate. What he found was shocking. The case files were a mess. Boxes of documents, scattered, mixed up evidence, and even entire pieces of crucial information that had been lost. And then, in an envelope that had never been opened, Gamberg found it, the long-forgotten tape of the 1984 anonymous phone tip. Someone had called to hint at the connection between Tina's remains and the Keddie murders, but instead of following up, authorities had ignored it. And this wasn't the only revelation. As Gamberg continued to dig through the files, he uncovered another piece of forgotten evidence, medical tape that had been collected from the crime scene floor. In 1981, investigators didn't have the forensic technology to extract DNA from the tape, but now, decades later, it was possible. The sample was sent for testing in 2016, and when the results came back, they confirmed something incredible. A DNA profile had been found. Not just any profile, but one that matched a known living suspect. Investigators didn't immediately release the name of the person connected to the DNA, but it was a massive break. It meant that, for the first time, they had forensic evidence linking someone directly to the crime. Then another shocking find surfaced. A man with a metal detector had been searching near a pond in Keddie when he found something rusted, half buried in the mud. It was a hammer. Not just any hammer, it was blue-handled, a perfect match to the hammer that Marty Smart had once reported missing. After nearly 4 decades, one of the murder weapons had been found, and eventually, more and more pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. In 2016, investigators finally located the Reno VA counselor who had once heard Marty Smart confess to the murders. Back in 1981, Marty had admitted to killing Sue and Tina. That statement had been passed to law enforcement, but had somehow never been acted upon. Then there was Marilyn Smart, Marty's ex-wife. She confirmed that the infamous letter Marty had written after the murders, the one where he said, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through," was real. She even admitted that on the morning of the murders, she had left Marty because she suspected him. Marilyn also revealed that she had found one of Tina's jackets inside their cabin after the killings. She turned it over to law enforcement, but just like so many other pieces of evidence in this case, it vanished. The more Gamberg uncovered, the more it became clear the original investigation had failed, and not just because of incompetence. There were growing suspicions that certain individuals had deliberately buried evidence. By 2016, Sheriff Hagwood and investigator Gamberg were publicly stating that they had identified suspects who had long escaped justice. They hinted that there were still living individuals who had been involved either in carrying out the murders or in covering them up. And most importantly, they were determined to hold them accountable. Marty Smart and Bo Boobity were both dead. Marty died in 2006 and Bo in 1988, but Hagwood and Gamberg believed at least 6 people had knowledge of the crime, and some of them were still alive. The investigation remains active to this day, and now, after decades of silence, justice for the victims of Cabin 28 may finally be within reach. It's amazing how the technology of today is being used to solve crimes that are decades old, though In the case of the Hinterkaifeck murders, it seems that no useful evidence remains. Do you know of any unsolved crimes that you'd like me to explore further? Leave a comment in the comments section, and who knows, maybe I'll explore your favorite mystery next time on Fridays with Tony. See you then.